This email came from Orson in Seattle, and when I read it, I had to put my phone down and walk away. This isn't your typical lost everything to a bar girl story. This is about how a successful American man got played so hard he didn't just lose his money, he lost his soul. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from. I read every comment, and if these stories hit something real for you, there's a super thanks button below. No pressure, but it helps keep these raw confessions coming. Orson Chen was 42 years old, living in his pristine downtown Seattle condo, pulling down $120,000 a year as a senior software engineer at Nike. On paper, his life looked perfect. Hell, most people would kill for his setup. But behind the success metrics and LinkedIn endorsements, Orson was drowning in emptiness. His divorce had been finalized 18 months earlier. Sarah had taken half of everything, which was fair enough, but she'd also taken something Orson didn't realize he'd missed so desperately: the simple comfort of having someone to come home to. The condo felt like a museum now. Beautiful, expensive, and completely lifeless. Friends kept telling him to get back out there, to download dating apps, to find someone new. But Seattle's dating scene felt like a corporate networking event where everyone was performing their best self. The conversations were polished, the photos were curated, and everything felt manufactured. That's when Orson made the decision that would change everything. He expanded his dating app radius to international. He told himself he was just curious, just exploring options. But deep down, he was looking for something authentic, something real that didn't exist in his sanitized world. The message came on a Tuesday evening in March. Orson was eating another microwave dinner, scrolling through profiles, when her photo appeared. Fawn, 28, from Chiang Mai, Thailand. She wasn't trying too hard. No pouty lips or bikini shots, just genuine smiles, photos at temples, pictures with what looked like her family. Her message was simple. Hello, Orson. I see you like travel and mountain. I live in beautiful mountain city, Chiang Mai. Your profile say you kind person. I hope we can be friend and maybe more. Sorry, my English, not perfect, but my heart is good. Something about the broken English and simple honesty hit Orson like a freight train. Here was someone who wasn't performing, wasn't trying to impress him with wit or wordplay. She was just being real. He responded immediately, and within an hour she wrote back. Then again. By the end of the week, they were exchanging messages daily. By the end of the month, they were video calling every morning and night. Fawn worked as a hotel receptionist at a mid-level place in Chiang Mai's old city. She lived with her mother, who was dealing with diabetes complications. Her father had died when she was young, leaving her as the primary support for her family. She had dreams of opening a small restaurant someday, serving traditional northern Thai food. During their video calls, Orson could see her simple apartment in the background. Nothing fancy, just clean and modest. She'd show him photos of dishes she'd cooked, temples she'd visited on weekends, the mountains surrounding her city. Everything felt genuine and unpretentious. I work very hard every day, she told him during one of their calls, her face tired but smiling. But I happy because I have good heart, and now I have you to talk with. You make my day bright, Orson. The contrast with his sterile Seattle existence was intoxicating. Here was someone who found joy in simple things, who wasn't caught up in career advancement or material accumulation. She asked about his work, but she seemed more interested in his feelings, his dreams, his happiness. 2 months into their daily conversations, Fawn's mother had a medical emergency. The hospital bills were mounting, and Fawn was working double shifts to cover costs. She never asked Orson for money directly, but she'd mention how worried she was, how she didn't know how she'd manage. Orson sent $2,000 without being asked. It felt good to help, to be needed, to make a real difference in someone's life. Fawn cried during their next video call, thanking him over and over, promising she'd pay him back somehow. You have beautiful heart, Orson. I never meet man like you. You make me believe in love again. Those words echoed in Orson's head for days. When was the last time someone had made him feel essential, appreciated, loved for who he was rather than what he could provide in terms of lifestyle or status? 3 months in, Orson made the decision. He was going to Thailand to meet Fawn in person, and if things went well, he was going to stay. Not temporarily, permanently. He was going to sell his condo, quit his job, and start a new life. His friends thought he'd lost his mind. His brother flew in from Seattle to stage what felt like an intervention. His parents called daily, begging him to reconsider, but Orson had made up his mind. He'd found something real, something worth risking everything for. The condo sold in 2 weeks for $380,000. After paying off the mortgage, Orson walked away with $180,000 in cash. He submitted his resignation at Nike, endured the concerned looks and whispered conversations from colleagues, and booked his one-way ticket to Chiang Mai. Fawn was waiting for him at the airport, holding a handmade sign with his name decorated with little hearts. She looked smaller in person, more delicate, but her smile was exactly as he remembered from their video calls. She threw her arms around him like they were reuniting lovers rather than meeting for the first time. "I cannot believe you really here," she whispered into his chest. "I so happy, Orson. I so happy." But something felt different. The conversation during the drive from the airport was more stilted than their flowing video chats. Fawn seemed distracted, checking her phone frequently, her responses shorter than usual. "I get us nice place to stay," she said as they pulled up to the Shangri-La Hotel. "Special for your first time in Thailand." Orson was confused. Based on their conversations, he'd expected something modest, in line with her simple lifestyle. The Shangri-La was luxury tier, the kind of place that would cost $200 a night. When he asked about it, Fawn waved dismissively. "My friend work here, get special price. I want you comfortable, Orson. You deserve best." The suite was stunning. Panoramic views of the mountains, marble bathroom, king-size bed with rose petals scattered across the comforter. It was romantic and thoughtful, but Orson couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the next few days, Fawn showed him around Chiang Mai. They visited temples, ate at street food stalls, took photos at scenic overlooks. She was attentive and affectionate, holding his hand, laughing at his jokes, making him feel like the most important person in the world. But there were moments of disconnect. Her English seemed to fluctuate, sometimes struggling with basic words they'd used easily in their video calls, other times using complex phrases he'd never heard from her before. When he mentioned it, she laughed it off. "I nervous when I with you in person. You make me shy, so I forget my English." 2 weeks into his stay, Fawn brought up her cousin's tour business. Somchai had been running motorcycle tours of northern Thailand for years, but he needed investment to expand, to buy new bikes and hire more guides. It was a sure thing, she assured Orson. Tourism was booming, and they could triple their money within a year. Somchai very smart businessman. He show me all papers, all numbers, but he need $45,000 to make big step. If you help, you become partner. We all make money together. Orson had never seen any business plan, never met Somchai, never even seen photos of the alleged tour operation. But Fawn was so enthusiastic, so confident, and she was asking him to trust her. Wasn't that what love was about? He transferred the money the next morning. Within days, Fawn's friends were having emergencies. Her friend Nim needed $3,000 for her daughter's school fees. Her friend Bo needed $2,000 to pay off gambling debts to avoid trouble with loan sharks. Her friend Mai needed $1,500 for her mother's surgery. Each request came with tears, with explanations about Thai culture and how helping friends was essential to being a good person. Orson found himself saying yes again and again, watching his bank balance shrink with each wire transfer. "You so generous, Orson. You have biggest heart. This why I love you so much." But Orson was starting to feel uneasy. In 6 weeks, he'd spent nearly $60,000 beyond his normal expenses. When he gently suggested they needed to be more careful with money, Fawn became upset. You think I use you for money? You think I bad woman? I love you, Orson. Money not important. But my friends, my family, they need help. If you cannot understand this, maybe you not understand Thai heart. The guilt was overwhelming. Here he was, a wealthy American, questioning the financial needs of people struggling to survive. He apologized, told her he was just being anxious about money because it was new to him, spending so freely. She forgave him with kisses and reassurances of her love. Orson rented them a luxury villa in the hills outside Chiang Mai. 3 bedrooms, infinity pool, daily housekeeping service. It cost $3,000 a month, but Fawn was so happy there, so relaxed and loving. She'd cook for him, give him massages, make love to him with a passion that felt genuine and overwhelming. This our home now, she whispered one evening as they watched the sunset from the pool deck. Our life together start here. But cracks were beginning to show. Orson noticed Fawn's phone was constantly buzzing with messages. When he asked about it, she'd say it was work or friends, but she'd always turn the screen away from him. Her laptop was password protected, and she'd quickly close it whenever he walked into the room. One afternoon, while she was showering, her phone rang on the counter. The caller ID showed a Western name, David UK. Orson stared at it, his stomach churning. When she came out of the bathroom, he asked about it. Oh, David is friend of my cousin, British man who live in Bangkok. Sometimes he asked about tour business, nothing important. But her explanation felt rehearsed, and she changed the subject quickly. That night, Orson couldn't sleep. He found himself checking Fawn's social media profiles for the first time in weeks. What he saw made his blood run cold. Photos from the past month showed her at expensive restaurants he'd never been to, wearing designer clothes he'd never seen, posing with different groups of well-dressed Western men. The photos were time-stamped during hours when she'd told him she was working or visiting family. In one photo, she was wearing a Gucci handbag that cost more than most Thais made in 6 months. In another, she was at a high-end Bangkok hotel, cocktail in hand, laughing with a group that included several older Western men. When Orson confronted her the next morning, Fawn broke down crying. Those photos old? From before I meet you? My phone, it post automatic sometimes? I not even remember taking those picture. Orson, you have to believe me. I love only you. Those other men, they just friends, business friends of my cousin. She was so distraught, so convincing in her tears, that Orson found himself apologizing for doubting her. But the seed of suspicion had been planted, and it was growing daily. 2 weeks later, Fawn's brother Niran needed $30,000 for a business emergency. His small construction company had a cash flow problem, and without an immediate injection of funds, he'd lose a major contract and have to lay off 20 workers. These people depend on my brother, Fawn explained, crying again. If he cannot pay them, their families suffer. How can we let this happen when we have money to help? Orson was reluctant, but the emotional manipulation was overwhelming. How could he let 20 families suffer when he had the means to help? He made the transfer, bringing his total financial outlay to over $90,000 in just 2 months. That night, he booked a business trip to Bangkok, telling Fawn he needed to explore opportunities for freelance software development work. He'd been thinking about how to make money in Thailand long term, and Bangkok had a growing tech scene. But instead of staying in Bangkok, he returned to Chiang Mai the next evening without telling Fawn. He wanted to surprise her, to show up with flowers and take her out for a romantic dinner. The villa was lit up when he arrived, music playing from the pool area. Orson smiled, thinking Fawn might be having a small gathering with friends. He grabbed the flowers from his car and headed toward the back of the house. What he saw through the sliding glass doors destroyed him completely. Fawn was in the pool with another Western man, tall, gray-haired, probably in his 50s. They were drinking champagne, laughing, clearly intimate. But it wasn't just the physical betrayal that shattered Orson. It was hearing Fawn speak. Her English was perfect. Not the broken, simple English she'd always used with him, but fluent, sophisticated, completely natural. The American is so fucking naive, she was saying, laughing as she floated on her back. He actually thinks I'm some poor village girl who needs his rescue. I've made almost 100,000 off him in 2 months, and he still believes every sob story I tell him. The older man laughed. How many are you running right now? 3 serious ones. The American is the biggest payday, but I've got a German in Phuket sending me money for my sick grandmother and an Australian in Bangkok who thinks he's helping me start a clothing business. The Australian is actually smarter, he asks more questions. But the American? He just wants to be the hero so badly that he doesn't see what's right in front of him. Orson felt like he was going to vomit. He backed away from the window, his legs shaking, his entire world collapsing around him. What's funny is that he thinks I love him, Fawn continued, her voice carrying across the water. He actually told me he'd never felt so appreciated by a woman. Can you imagine? A 42-year-old man who's that desperate for validation? It's almost sad. Orson stumbled back to his car and drove aimlessly through Chiang Mai's empty streets until dawn. Everything made sense now. The fluctuating English, the expensive tastes hidden behind claims of simplicity, the constant emergencies requiring money, the mysterious business investments, the photos with other men. He'd been played so completely, so thoroughly, that he felt like a character in a badly written movie, except this was his life, his money, his heart that had been shredded. When he returned to the villa the next morning, Fawn was alone, making breakfast, humming happily. She looked up with a bright smile when he walked in. Orson, you back early. I miss you so much, my love. The performance was flawless. If he hadn't heard her the night before, he might have believed it was genuine. We need to talk, he said quietly. Something in his tone must have alerted her, because her expression shifted slightly, but she maintained the act. Of course, darling. What about? Orson told her what he'd seen and heard. As he spoke, he watched her face transform. The sweet, innocent expression melted away, replaced by something cold and calculating. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she laughed. You want to know the truth, Orson? Fine. Here's the truth. I never loved you. Not for 1 second. You were just another lonely Western man with more money than sense, looking for some fantasy Asian girlfriend who would worship you for saving her from poverty. Her voice was different now, confident, mocking, completely without the accent she'd maintained for months. My mother isn't sick. My family doesn't need money. I don't work at some shitty hotel. I make more money in 3 months running guys like you than most people make in 5 years at regular jobs. And you made it so easy. Orson felt like he was looking at a complete stranger. The cousin's tour business? Doesn't exist. My brother's construction company? Made up. My friend's emergencies? All fiction. Every story I told you was designed to separate you from your money, and you fell for every single one. But you seem so genuine, Orson whispered. I'm a very good actress, and you were a very good audience. Desperate, lonely, eager to believe that some beautiful young woman could fall in love with a middle-aged software engineer from Seattle just because he was kind. The cruelty in her voice was devastating, but she wasn't finished. You want to know what the funniest part is? You actually thought you were rescuing me. You thought you were the hero in some romantic story. But you were just the mark in a con game that I've been running for years. Orson realized he was crying and he hated himself for it. I need my money back. Fawn laughed again. What money? I don't owe you anything. You gave me gifts. You invested in businesses. You helped my friends and family. All voluntary. You have no legal claim to any of it. You defrauded me. Prove it. Show me one document where I promised to pay you back. Show me one contract that says your gifts were loans. You can't, because they don't exist. You were just a generous boyfriend helping his girlfriend's family. At least, that's what any court would see. Orson realized she was right. He'd been so eager to help, so trusting, that he'd never asked for documentation, never insisted on contracts, never protected himself legally. Besides, Fawn continued. Even if you could prove fraud, do you really want to go through Thai courts as a foreigner? Do you want to explain to a judge why you came to Thailand and immediately started sending large amounts of money to a woman you'd known for 3 months? How do you think that's going to look? The trap was perfect. She'd taken his money, his trust, his love, and she'd structured it so that he had no recourse. He was completely fucked. Get out of my house, she said finally. I'm done with you. There are other men who need my attention now. Orson packed his few belongings and left. He'd rented the villa through the end of the month, but he couldn't bear to stay. He moved into a cheap guest house in the old city, the kind of place backpackers stayed, with thin walls and shared bathrooms. He had $80,000 left from his original savings, but his visa was about to expire, and he had no job, no home, no purpose. For the first time in his adult life, Orson Chen had no plan. The depression hit like a physical weight. He'd lie in his narrow bed, listening to other travelers, planning their adventures, their voices full of excitement and possibility, and he'd feel like he was underwater, drowning in his own stupidity. He couldn't bring himself to call his family. How could he explain that he'd thrown away everything, his career, his home, his financial security, for a woman who had never existed? How could he admit that he'd been so desperate for love that he'd ignored every warning sign, every red flag, every instinct that tried to protect him? The shame was overwhelming. He'd always thought of himself as intelligent, rational, successful. Now he felt like the biggest fool who'd ever lived. Weeks passed in a haze of self-loathing and isolation. Orson would sit in internet cafes, staring at job posting websites, unable to concentrate on anything. He'd walk through Chiang Mai's markets and temples, seeing couples holding hands, and feel like his chest was caving in. Other expats tried to talk to him sometimes. The bar owner where he'd drink his solitary beers. The English teacher at the guest house who'd recognized a fellow American in distress. But Orson couldn't bear to tell his story, couldn't handle the mixture of pity and judgment he imagined he'd see in their eyes. One evening, a British man named Trevor sat down next to him at the bar. Trevor was in his 60s, weathered and cynical, the kind of expat who'd been in Thailand so long he'd seen everything. "Let me guess," Trevor said after ordering his beer. "Thai girlfriend took you for everything you had?" Orson looked up, surprised. "Mate, I can spot it from across the room. The shell-shocked look, the cheap accommodation, the way you nurse one beer for 3 hours. We've all been there." "All of us?" Trevor laughed bitterly. "Thai women have turned separating Western men from their money into an art form. Some do it through bars and short-term cons. Others, the smart ones, they play the long game. Build relationships, create families that need help, invent emergencies. You probably thought you'd found the one genuine Thai woman who wasn't after your wallet." Orson felt like he was going to be sick. "How much?" Trevor asked. 100,000. Trevor whistled low. "Fucking hell. That's a proper gutting. Most of us only lose 20 or 30 before we wise up. I thought she loved me." "Of course you did. That's the whole point. They're not just taking your money, mate. They're selling you the fantasy of being loved, being needed, being the hero. It's the most expensive drug in the world." Trevor bought Orson another beer, and slowly, painfully, Orson found himself telling the whole story. It felt like poison leaving his system, but also like confirmation of his complete stupidity. "The worst part," Trevor said when Orson finished, "is that you'll never get over wondering if any of it was real. Even knowing it was all an act, part of you will always wonder if she felt something, anything, genuine." Orson realized Trevor was right. Even now, even after hearing her mock him so cruelly, part of him still wanted to believe that some moments had been real. His visa expired 3 days later. Orson barely had enough money left for a plane ticket home. He'd spent 2 months in Thailand and lost over $100,000. But the money wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was facing the man he'd become, someone so desperate for love that he'd abandoned all common sense, all self-protection, all dignity. The flight back to Seattle felt like a funeral procession. Orson stared out the window as Thailand disappeared below him, feeling like he was leaving behind not just a country, but his entire sense of who he was. His brother picked him up at SEA. Orson had finally broken down and called him from Bangkok, admitting that he needed help getting home. The conversation had been humiliating, but his brother had wired him money for the ticket without asking questions. "You look like hell," his brother said as they drove through the familiar Seattle streets. Orson was staying in his childhood bedroom at his parents' house. At 42 years old, he was sleeping under posters of bands he'd loved in high school, eating dinner at 6 p.m. with his concerned parents, trying to figure out how to rebuild a life he'd voluntarily destroyed. The job search was brutal. Explaining an employment gap was challenging enough, but explaining why he'd quit a good position to move to Thailand for a relationship that had imploded was nearly impossible. Orson found himself lying in interviews, claiming he'd taken time off to care for a sick relative. After 3 months of rejection, he finally landed a contract position at a startup, making half what he'd earned at Nike. It was humbling work, junior-level tasks for someone with his experience, but it was a start. Slowly, painfully, Orson began to rebuild. He moved into a studio apartment. Nothing like the condo he'd owned before, but it was his. He started therapy, trying to understand how he'd become so vulnerable to manipulation. He joined a support group for people who'd been victims of romance scams. The group was eye-opening. Orson realized he wasn't alone, wasn't uniquely stupid. There were dozens of people, men and women, young and old, smart and successful, who'd all fallen for variations of the same con. The details were different, but the emotional manipulation was identical. The thing about these scams, their counselor explained, is that they target our deepest human needs, the need to be loved, to be needed, to be the hero in our own story. The scammers are selling us versions of ourselves that we desperately want to believe in. Orson learned about the psychology of manipulation, about how isolation and vulnerability create perfect conditions for exploitation. He learned about the techniques Fawn had used: love bombing, intermittent reinforcement, financial grooming, emotional manipulation. Understanding the mechanics helped, but it didn't erase the shame. Orson still felt like he should have known better, should have been smarter, should have protected himself. 2 years later, Orson was in a different place entirely. He'd been promoted twice at the startup, eventually earning back most of his original salary. He'd moved into a decent apartment, rebuilt his savings account, even started dating again. Her name was Jennifer, and she was nothing like Fawn. She was a divorce attorney from Seattle, practical and direct, with 2 kids and a mortgage and all the complicated reality that Fawn had pretended not to have. Their relationship was built on transparency, on honest communication, on the messy truth of 2 middle-aged people trying to build something real together. "I know about Thailand," Jennifer told him early in their relationship. "My friend showed me the news articles about romance scams. I need you to know that I'm not judging you for what happened, but I also need you to know that I'm not going to be patient with lies or deception. I've been through one marriage where someone wasn't honest with me." Her directness was refreshing. There was no performance, no manipulation, no hidden agenda, just 2 people trying to figure out if they could build something together. Orson still thought about Fawn sometimes, not with longing, but with a kind of clinical fascination. How had she become so skilled at emotional manipulation? Did she ever feel guilty about the lives she'd destroyed? Did she ever wonder about the men she'd left behind? He'd learned through internet searches that she was still active, still running the same cons on different men. Her social media showed the same lifestyle: expensive restaurants, designer clothes, photos with various Western men who all looked hopeful and proud to be with her. Part of Orson wanted to warn them, to reach out and explain what they were walking into, but he knew they wouldn't listen. He wouldn't have listened either. The fantasy was too appealing, the need too desperate. Instead, Orson channeled his experience into helping others. He volunteered with the romance scam support group, sharing his story with new victims who were struggling with the same shame and confusion he'd felt. He'd started a blog about his experience, which had attracted hundreds of readers dealing with similar situations. The hardest part, He'd tell new group members, isn't losing the money. It's losing your faith in your own judgment. It's wondering if you'll ever be able to trust someone again, or if you'll ever be able to trust yourself. But Orson had learned that recovery was possible. It required rebuilding not just your financial security, but your emotional security. It required learning to see red flags without becoming paranoid, to remain open to love without becoming naive. I'm not grateful for what happened to me, Orson would tell people who asked if he'd learned valuable lessons from the experience. I wouldn't wish this kind of betrayal on anyone, but I'm grateful for who I became because of how I chose to respond to it. The man who'd been destroyed in Thailand was gone forever. In his place was someone harder but kinder, more cautious but more genuine, less trusting but more trustworthy. Someone who understood that real love doesn't require you to prove it with money, doesn't demand that you sacrifice your security for someone else's emergencies, doesn't ask you to ignore your instincts in favor of your fantasies. Orson had moved to Thailand for love and ended up completely destroyed. But sometimes, he'd learned, complete destruction is just another word for the opportunity to rebuild yourself into someone stronger than you were before. The email Orson sent me ended with this: I hope my story helps someone avoid the mistake I made. But more than that, I hope it helps someone understand that even when you lose everything, your money, your home, your sense of who you are, you can still find your way back to a life worth living. Just not the life you thought you wanted.